In March of 1891, John, a boy of no more than 12, was led through the slick, rain-darkened streets of Charleston to the county jail. His small hands, calloused by work with herbs and carving wood, trembled slightly, not from fear but from the anticipation of what awaited him. The cobblestones beneath his feet glimmered under the drizzle, reflecting the dim gas lamps that lined the narrow streets, while the tang of salt from the nearby harbor mixed with smoke from countless chimneys, creating a scent both familiar and suffocating. The townspeople had begun to whisper, and whispers had a way of gaining weight, of gathering men and women like a storm. 20 men from the local council had assembled, their faces pale with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The rumor was simple yet impossible. This boy, John, had survived events that should have ended him, and had exhibited powers no one could explain. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, the murmurs had become outright speculation. Some spoke of witchcraft, others of divine providence, and a few, in hushed tones, whispered the words no one dared speak aloud: "He is dangerous." John's dark eyes, wide and solemn, scanned the crowd without fear. There was something about him that unsettled those who dared look too closely, a quiet certainty, a depth that seemed impossible for a boy his age. He walked steadily, shoulders squared, head held high, as if the world were merely a stage upon which he had already rehearsed his lines. What they did not know was that his gaze held a secret inherited from generations long past, a legacy buried in the bloodline of men and women who had survived the cruelties of plantations through uncanny perception, foresight, and a touch that seemed to bend outcomes in their favor. The magistrate awaited him inside the grim courthouse, a man whose face was a study in both authority and unease. He was flanked by clerks and scribes, quills poised, their inkwells nearly empty but their curiosity inexhaustible. When John entered, silence fell, heavy and expectant. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand why you are here, John?" the magistrate asked, voice measured but trembling slightly, betraying the anxiety that had taken root in the room. "I only did what was right," John replied, his voice soft but carrying a weight far beyond his years. It was a voice that made men lean forward involuntarily, as though drawn by some unseen force. The magistrate swallowed hard. "Yet witnesses claim you have unusual abilities. That you see things, remember things, influence outcomes in ways no child should." John tilted his head, considering the words carefully. "I see what is," he said simply, "and I act." None of them knew the full truth. They had seen only fragments, small, inexplicable events that defied reason. A lost dog would appear at his window days after it had vanished. A coin missing from a neighbor's purse would reappear in exactly the right hand at exactly the right moment. Each act left observers unnerved, teetering between awe and terror. And now John stood before them, a boy who should have been powerless, yet who radiated an authority that no adult could challenge. Outside, the rain had begun to fall harder, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that seemed to echo the tension inside the courthouse. Shadows twisted along the walls, cast by flickering lanterns and the dim sunlight that struggled through the clouds. In that muted light, John's features seemed to sharpen. The dark set of his eyes, the curve of his jaw, the quiet determination of his posture. Some in the room felt a chill, as though the air itself had grown colder. A merchant from the docks, one of the many witnesses to John's strange interventions, had been brought to testify. He described a scene in the marshes, where John had saved him from drowning in the mud, guiding him with a strength and precision that no ordinary boy possessed. As he recounted the event, the merchant's voice wavered. It was as if the boy knew the river's currents before they even moved, he said, shaking. As if he could command the very earth. Gasps rose from the magistrate and his clerks. Some exchanged worried glances, others muttered prayers under their breath. The weight of superstition hung heavy in the air. It was a town on the brink of fear, unsure whether to treat John as a child or a force beyond comprehension. Before the magistrate could speak further, John's grandmother, Mercy, arrived at the courthouse. A woman hardened by decades of toil and loss, she approached him without hesitation, her hands resting briefly on his shoulders. "Remember who you are, child," she whispered. "The world does not forgive those who are different." "I know, grandmother," John replied, eyes steady. Yet there was a fire within them, a hunger that refused to be dimmed by caution or fear. What they did not know was that above the courthouse roof, hidden from view, a pair of eyes had been observing. A man of influence, curious and calculating, had been following John's movements for weeks, waiting for the right moment to intervene. What he did not realize was that John's gift extended beyond mere observation. It anticipated intentions, predicted actions, and often revealed truths that even the most cunning men could not conceal. The magistrate leaned forward, quill poised. "Do you claim these accounts are true?" he asked, voice low, almost a whisper. John's lips pressed together briefly, then he spoke with a calm certainty that silenced the room. "I do not claim. I act. What will be, will be." A heavy pause followed. No one moved. No one dared question him further. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the streets, washing the cobblestones in silver light. The world seemed suspended, holding its breath, waiting to see what this boy, this anomaly, would do next. By the time the day was done, the town's whispers had transformed into outright fear. The council decided. John would be placed in the county jail until they could determine the proper course of action. And though the cell awaited him, the boy did not flinch. He walked into confinement as though stepping onto a stage, aware of every gaze, every heartbeat, every shadow. What really happened to John? What did the boy do that terrified everyone who witnessed it? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Charleston in the spring of 1891 was a city of contradictions. Its streets, paved unevenly with ancient cobblestones, bore the footprints of centuries, slave traders, merchants, soldiers, and children alike. The harbor stretched like a silver tongue, dotted with ships that creaked and groaned against their moorings, their sails flapping lazily in the warm March breeze. Smoke from countless chimneys mingled with the tang of salt and brine, a scent both oppressive and comforting, like the city itself. The city's wealth was still evident in the grand mansions along the Battery, their whitewashed columns gleaming faintly under the muted sunlight that struggled through heavy clouds. Gardens overflowed with azaleas, magnolias, and creeping ivy, yet behind the beauty lay the scars of history, plantations that had fed this wealth with the blood and labor of enslaved people, streets lined with the remnants of war, and neighborhoods where poverty festered quietly, hidden behind shuttered windows. In the district of Ansonboro, where the air smelled of damp earth and the faint stench of fish from the nearby wharves, John lived with his grandmother, Mercy. Their home was modest, a small timber frame house with peeling paint and an attic that barely admitted light through the slatted windows. Inside, the scent of herbs and dried flowers mingled with the ever-present tang of wood smoke, creating a strange, almost mystical atmosphere. Mercy moved with careful deliberation, her hands steady and worn from decades of labor in the fields of Georgia before she had been brought to Charleston. Her voice, though stern, held a soft undertone reserved solely for John. "Child," she would say, her dark eyes sharp and assessing, "you must watch the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." John, in turn, absorbed her lessons with an intensity that unsettled even her. He watched the birds, the river, the way shadows fell at different times of the day, noting patterns that others overlooked. He memorized faces, words, and movements with uncanny precision. And though he appeared to be a boy like any other, there was something within him, a calm, perceptive awareness, that suggested he belonged to a different order of knowing. By morning, he could recount conversations held in secret, remember the location of lost objects, and anticipate outcomes before they unfolded. Neighbors had begun to notice. A missing hen would appear atop the fence, a misplaced trinket found exactly where it was needed. Some smiled and marveled. Others whispered behind closed doors, unease etched into their faces. Charleston itself seemed to pulse with stories of its past. Street vendors called out in rhythmic cadences, their voices blending with the clip-clop of horse hooves and the faint toll of church bells. Children played barefoot in the mud, their laughter a fragile contrast to the shadows that clung to the alleys. The river, sluggish in its tidal pull, carried barges laden with rice, cotton, and timber, while the cries of gulls pierced the humid air. All of it, the sights, the smells, the sounds, formed a tapestry in which John's awareness wove itself like an invisible thread. It was here, in the city's dense and layered existence, that John began to notice the currents of power and secrecy that pulsed beneath Charleston's genteel surface. Wealthy merchants and plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about business and politics, their words carrying threats and favors in equal measure. Freedmen worked tirelessly, balancing precariously between the opportunities of freedom and the lingering oppression of a society that had long sought to limit them. And amidst it all, children like John observed, absorbing more than most adults realized. John's grandmother often reminded him of the dangers. "You see too much, child. People do not like to be seen," she said one afternoon as he polished small wooden toys he had carved from scraps of pine and cedar. "You must be careful. Do not reveal what you can do. Let them think you are only a boy, nothing more." "I understand," John replied, his hand steady even as the words fell from his lips. Yet even in that moment, there was an intensity in his gaze, a spark that hinted at the extraordinary events that would soon unfold. What Mercy did not know was that forces beyond their understanding had begun to stir. Observers, both seen and unseen, had taken notice. Men of influence, cloaked in wealth and authority, were already whispering John's name, debating whether his presence was a blessing or a threat. 3 streets over, in the shadow of a crumbling brick church, a pair of figures watched from a doorway. One, a tall man with a scar tracing down his cheek, muttered to his companion, "That boy, he is no ordinary child. Keep your eyes on him. He will change things, mark my words." Meanwhile, John moved through his routine with calm focus. He gathered herbs for Mercy's remedies, carved toys, and practiced small acts of precision, balancing stones along the edge of the riverbank, observing the way shadows shifted with the sun. Each gesture, each careful movement, reinforced the idea that he was attentive to the hidden patterns of the world, aware of currents invisible to others. By mid-morning, he had already noticed discrepancies in conversations, misremembered numbers, and hidden tensions among the townspeople. He catalogued them silently, storing knowledge for a moment when it might be needed, and always aware that someone, somewhere, had begun watching him with intent. Charleston, in all its layered history, its wealth and decay, its whispers and shadows, had become the stage for a story that no one yet fully understood. And at the center of it all was John, the boy whose abilities defied explanation, whose presence unsettled and fascinated in equal measure, and whose life was about to enter a chapter that would terrify and astonish the city alike. What he did not know was that by the end of the month, his abilities would be tested, feared, and celebrated in ways no child should ever endure. The city's eyes were upon him, and the currents of destiny had begun to pull him toward events that would leave Charleston forever changed. John's earliest memories were fragments of loss and whispered lessons. His father had been sold to a plantation 50 miles upriver when John was only 5, a man torn from his family and traded like an object. His mother, frail and fevered, had died soon after, leaving his grandmother Mercy to raise him alone. She was a woman tempered by hardship, a survivor of Georgia's relentless fields, and though her heart was full of love, it was tempered by the unforgiving knowledge that the world would never be kind to a black child, no matter how innocent. "John," she said one evening as he crouched by the fire, smoothing the rough surface of a small wooden toy he had carved, "the world watches you. It tests you always. You must watch it back. Remember every face, every word, every shadow." "I do," John replied, eyes dark and solemn, reflecting the flickering firelight. There was a gravity in his tone that made Mercy pause. She had raised many children, but none like this one. Something about him, something beyond the ordinary, radiated from his very being. From the earliest age, John noticed things others missed. The neighbors' disputes over missing tools, the silent whispers of adults in the streets, the subtle gestures that betrayed unspoken intentions. All of it became a tapestry he could read, a map of actions and consequences invisible to ordinary eyes. He remembered every face, every movement, every word spoken in private, storing them with a clarity that unsettled those who glimpsed it. Mercy often watched him in wonder and fear. She had noticed how he seemed to anticipate accidents before they occurred. A panicked chicken would dart across the yard moments before a child's foot struck it. A rolling barrel would be stopped with a precise shove of his hand, saving a passerby from injury. At first, she attributed these incidents to luck, or perhaps keen observation. But as the months passed, it became clear that John's perception went beyond what even the sharpest eyes could detect. "You are different," she told him once, her voice low as she braided his hair. "And the world does not forgive those who are different. You must hide it or it will be used against you." John nodded, but there was a quiet defiance in his posture, a sense that while he would heed her warning, he would not dim what he was. What Mercy did not know was that his gift was not mere instinct. It was ancestral. Long before he was born, generations of his family had survived cruelty, exploitation, and oppression with an uncanny awareness of the unseen. They had whispered of visions, premonitions, and abilities passed through bloodlines, secrets kept from the world. John was the first in decades to manifest it fully, a living testament to a legacy buried in history and survival. The signs began subtly. A coin that had been lost for days appeared in his pocket at the precise moment it was needed. A neighbor's dog, missing since morning, returned to his window as if guided by invisible hands. Small acts of foresight became more complex. He would warn neighbors of storms before the clouds gathered, recall conversations with unnerving accuracy, and predict when arguments would escalate or settle. People began to notice. Some marveled, others whispered of witchcraft or divine intervention. One afternoon, while helping Mercy in their modest garden, John paused and tilted his head toward the street. "The man from the bakery will drop the basket today," he said. His grandmother glanced up, curious. Moments later, a clatter echoed from the street. A man, flour spilling across his apron, cursed as the basket fell. Mercy's eyes widened. "You see," John said softly, "I do not guess. I see what is." By the age of 11, these abilities had begun to attract attention beyond their small household. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the boy who could remember every word, foresee small accidents, and intervene with uncanny precision. Some avoided him, fear evident in their gaze. Others watched, fascinated, wondering what he might do next. Yet John remained humble in appearance. He carried the weight of his observations silently, never boasting, never revealing more than necessary. There was a wisdom in his demeanor that belied his age, a composure that unsettled even adults who encountered him. They would remember him, if not with fear, then with a quiet, unshakable awe. It was during this time that unseen eyes began to follow him. Men and women of influence, cloaked in power and wealth, noticed his uncanny awareness and whispered among themselves. One evening, a figure leaned against a doorway, observing John as he tended the small garden. "He is no ordinary child," the observer murmured. "Mark my words, he will alter the course of events in ways none of us can foresee." The boy, of course, did not know he was being watched. He had learned long ago to observe without revealing, to act without unnecessary interference, to step lightly through a world that demanded conformity. Each act of kindness or intervention was measured, deliberate, and precise. It was not merely instinct, it was strategy, guided by an awareness that extended beyond the visible, into the very currents of chance and consequence. Even at home, he displayed a depth of understanding that startled Mercy. One evening, as they shared the evening meal, he noted the subtle tension between neighbors across the street, predicting a quarrel before it erupted. "They do not speak true," he said quietly, voice calm. "I know what they think before they say it." Mercy's hand trembled slightly as she passed him the bread. "Child, you are a marvel, and a danger. Keep this secret close. The world will not forgive it otherwise." John nodded, eyes distant, as if peering beyond the walls of the small attic into a horizon none could yet see. He had already begun to understand the power, and the burden, of his gift. It would protect him, it would unsettle those around him, and it would place him squarely in the path of forces far greater than a child's simple understanding. By the end of that spring, John's abilities had begun to shape the perception of all who encountered him. People spoke of him in whispers and wonder, debating whether he was touched by something divine, cursed, or simply blessed with extraordinary skill. What they did not yet know was that events were already in motion that would bring him into conflict with the most powerful men in Charleston, and that his life, so ordinary in appearance, would soon enter a chapter of danger, awe, and revelation that none could have anticipated. The first true demonstration of John's abilities outside the walls of his modest home occurred on a humid morning in April, when the tide of the Ashley River was unusually high, and mist clung to the marshes like a spectral veil. The air was thick with the brine of the harbor, mixed with the faint, sweet rot of spring mud, a pungent perfume that hung over the riverbanks. John had been walking along the edge of the marsh, collecting reeds for his grandmother's basket weaving, when he noticed the small crowd gathered around the docks. A merchant, Mr. Caleb Whitmore, had been attempting to retrieve a crate of sugar that had slipped into the water. He struggled desperately, the current tugging at his feet, his arms flailing as the river threatened to claim both him and the cargo. The men who had gathered could only shout encouragement or curse his misfortune, but none dared risk plunging into the treacherous mud themselves. Their fear, mixed with the practical impossibility of rescue, left Whitmore teetering on the edge of calamity. John paused, noting the exact angle of the current, the placement of the crate, and the weak points in the bank where a slip could send both man and cargo further into the water. He stepped forward, barefoot, the soft mud sucking at his ankles, yet he moved with a surety that seemed impossible for one so young. "Step back," he called, voice calm but carrying authority. "Do not reach for it. I will guide you." The men froze, unsure whether to comply. Whitmore, desperate, glanced at the boy and then at the river, realizing he had no other choice. Do what you can, boy," he stammered. John gestured precisely, directing the man where to shift his weight, where to place his hands, and when to pull. With an ease that defied his size, he leveraged the water's flow, redirecting the crate against the bank. Whitmore was pulled free just as his balance faltered. He stumbled onto the mud, soaked and trembling, clutching the crate as though it were a lifeline. The crowd gasped. Some laughed nervously, some murmured in awe, and a few drew back, eyes wide with unease. "Did you see that?" a fisherman whispered. He knew where to place his hands before the boy even moved. John said nothing, brushing the mud from his hands as if the feat were routine. His eyes scanned the spectators briefly, noting the men whose gazes lingered too long, the women clutching children protectively, the merchants whispering among themselves. What they did not know, and what John did not yet comprehend fully, was that this incident would seed both admiration and suspicion in Charleston, and that forces within the city were already debating how to contain a boy whose presence unsettled even seasoned adults. Word spread quickly, carried from street to street like wildfire in dry brush. Children repeated the tale with wide eyes, merchants discussed it in hushed tones, and housewives whispered warnings of unnatural power. Rumors began to grow. Some claimed John had predicted the fall of the crate, others suggested he had manipulated the river itself. None of it mattered to John. He did not seek recognition. He merely acted as circumstances required. The following day he encountered another test, equally minor in appearance but revealing in consequence. A neighbor's horse had escaped its pen, bolting down the narrow streets of Ansonboro, threatening children playing in the alley. Panic erupted. Adults ran after the animal, shouting, but the horse moved unpredictably, weaving dangerously between children and obstacles. John stood quietly on a stoop, observing the path, reading the tension in the horse's movements and the rhythm of its panic. "Step aside," he commanded, more to himself than anyone else. But the adults instinctively obeyed. He ran, small and swift, and intercepted the animal at the perfect angle, extending a hand in a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. The horse slowed, nudged by his presence, then obeyed an invisible command, its hooves finding the right path. Children who had moments before scattered in terror now gathered cautiously, awe in their wide eyes. Some of the adults muttered about witchcraft. Others spoke of divine intervention. None could explain how a boy so small had a control over circumstance that seemed preternatural. And John, observing quietly, noticed that the men in the shadows, those who had begun following him, recorded every detail, every reaction, every whispered word. By midweek the town was abuzz. Marketplaces filled with speculation, taverns echoed with debate, and whispers of fear and fascination traveled from the wharves to the grandest homes along the Battery. John remained outwardly unremarkable, appearing only as a boy attending his duties, but those who watched more closely began to realize he was anything but ordinary. It was during these early days that the first real confrontation with authority arose. A local overseer, Thomas Caldwell, whose temper was as sharp as the whip he carried, cornered John near the docks. "Boy," he barked, "you've done enough meddling in affairs that are not yours. You think yourself clever, do you?" John looked at him steadily, calm and unflinching. "I do not meddle," he said. "I act as needed." Caldwell's expression darkened. "Mark my words, you will answer for this. I do not care for excuses." John turned away without a word, but his gaze lingered briefly on the water and the crowds that had gathered, noting faces, positions, and intentions. What Caldwell did not know and could not know was that John's awareness had already predicted the next sequence of events in the city, foreseeing outcomes that no adult could anticipate. By the end of that week, the town was split between awe and fear. People whispered in doorways and marketplaces, debating whether he was blessed, cursed, or something entirely other. And none of them realized that this first public reveal of John's abilities was merely the beginning. It was a small ripple that would soon swell into a wave that threatened to unsettle the social order, challenge the authority of Charleston's elite, and set a 12-year-old boy on a path no child had ever walked. What he did not know was that the magistrate had already received word of the incidents, and that arrangements were being made for a formal inquiry into the boy's actions. What he could not yet see was that the curiosity and fear he inspired would soon converge in a way that would place him directly in the hands of the law, and that the city itself would come to witness feats that defied explanation. And thus, John's presence in Charleston moved from whispered rumor to undeniable reality. A boy, small yet extraordinary, had announced, without speaking, that the world would have to reckon with him. And the first of many who would fear, respect, or attempt to control him had already taken note. By late April, Charleston had grown uneasy. The boy who had saved lives and predicted mishaps had become the subject of whispered debates in parlors, taverns, and behind closed doors. Merchants argued about the implications of his abilities, clergymen muttered prayers against powers they could not name, and mothers clutched their children closer, eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. Each mention of John carried an undercurrent of dread, as if simply speaking his name might invite calamity. It was in this climate that Sheriff Daniel Whitcomb received the first formal complaint. A group of influential merchants had written, insisting that the boy be detained for his unnatural influence upon the community. They cited the river rescue, the horse incident, and other unexplained occurrences as evidence. Whitcomb, a man who prided himself on pragmatism and calm judgment, read the letter with unease. "What is it about children that frightens grown men so?" he muttered to his deputy, a wiry young man named Hawkins. "We've arrested thieves, gamblers, even escaped convicts. Yet a boy, 12 years old, has the entire city whispering." Hawkins shrugged, uneasy. "It isn't the boy, sir. It's what he does. No one can explain it. And that scares people more than any thief or murderer ever could." Whitcomb frowned, closing the letter carefully. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll investigate. Quietly. I do not want a panic." By mid-morning, word reached John and Mercy. A man, dressed in the sheriff's uniform but wary of drawing attention, approached their modest home. "John Whitmore?" he asked, voice low, eyes darting. "I am John," he replied, calm as ever. His dark eyes met the officer's steadily, revealing nothing, yet assessing every movement. "You are to come with me, boy. Sheriff wishes to speak." Mercy's hand froze over the handle of the door. "He has done nothing wrong," she said, voice trembling. "This is a child. What reason?" "You will have your say later, ma'am," the officer interrupted gently but firmly. "For now he must come." John, silent, followed the man. He had walked streets, fields, and docks many times before, observing patterns, predicting outcomes, yet even now he noted every detail: the angle of the sunlight, the position of neighbors' windows, the faint scent of mud and smoke that hinted at who might be watching. What he did not yet know was that his actions in the coming hours would be scrutinized by Charleston's most powerful, and would spark events that no one, child or adult, could have foreseen. They walked swiftly but quietly, avoiding the main streets until they reached the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Whitcomb, tall and square-shouldered, greeted him with a cautious expression. "John," he began, voice deliberate, "you are accused of acts that defy reason. Some say you perform miracles. Others claim unnatural manipulation. What do you have to say for yourself?" John regarded him silently, weighing words carefully. "I act as necessary," he said finally. "I do not seek praise, nor do I harm. I see what is and I respond." Whitcomb's frown deepened. "Do you understand why this alarms people?" "I understand fear," John replied. "But fear does not change what is." The sheriff exchanged a glance with his deputy. Both men felt the weight of the boy's gaze. It was not arrogance nor defiance. It was certainty, a clarity of perception that unsettled even seasoned lawmen. "What do you intend to do with him?" John asked quietly, though the question held more weight than mere curiosity. Whitcomb faltered, then straightened. "We will place you in protective custody until we determine the facts. The city must be calmed." John nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He did not resist. He had learned long ago that confrontation could be measured, that timing, patience, and observation often held more power than defiance. News of the arrest traveled quickly. By noon, Charleston buzzed. Some residents expressed relief, believing the law had finally contained the boy whose abilities unnerved them. Others murmured disapproval, seeing injustice in the confinement of a child who had done no wrong. Merchants whispered about divine intervention, clergy spoke of moral trials, and children asked why the boy who could save lives was now treated as a criminal. In the jail, John was placed in a small, sparsely furnished cell. The stone walls were cold, the air damp and heavy. He sat quietly on the bench, hands folded, listening to the distant sounds of the city, the clatter of horse hooves, the voices of merchants, the occasional tolling of a church bell. He noted everything: which guards paced nervously, which keys rattled most often, the faint odor of tobacco smoke wafting from the hallway. Mercy had been allowed a brief visit. She clasped his hands, fingers trembling. "Child," she whispered, "remember who you are. Be cautious. The world is not ready for what you can do." "I know," he said softly. "I will not falter. I only act as necessary." What Whitcomb did not know, and what the merchants feared, was that the boy's abilities extended beyond mere observation. He had already mapped the layout of the jail in his mind, predicted the guard shifts, and understood the sequence of events that could occur if someone attempted to harm or manipulate him. He did not speak of it, but the awareness was already at work. Outside, Charleston prepared for what many believed would be a spectacle. Rumors spread. Some claimed John had influenced the tides, saved lives, and predicted outcomes with unnatural precision. Others suggested more sinister explanations. Men in shadowed corners debated whether to intervene, watch, or wait. Every observer, every whisperer, every cautious adult contributed to a growing tension that pressed down on the city like the oppressive humidity before a storm. By evening, the sheriff convened a council of concerned citizens and influential figures. "This boy," Whitcomb said, voice measured, "is extraordinary. But extraordinary men, or children, can disrupt order. We must decide how to proceed carefully, lest we invite chaos." No one yet knew the full extent of John's abilities. They could not see that he had already begun to influence events from within the jail, subtle and deliberate, preparing for the sequence that would soon engulf the city. What they feared most, what none of them truly understood, was that John was already several moves ahead of them, aware of intentions, plotting responses, and quietly commanding circumstances they could not perceive. Charleston slept uneasily that night. Lanterns flickered in windows, guards patrolled streets with sharpened vigilance, and whispers traveled through alleys and marketplaces. The boy who should have been powerless was no longer confined to mere rumor. He had stepped fully into reality, and the city, unprepared, would soon see the consequences. The jail of Charleston was a grim structure, its stone walls thick, cold, and unforgiving. Narrow windows admitted only slivers of light, their iron bars casting long, jagged shadows across the damp floor. The air smelled of mold, unwashed bodies, and the faint tang of sweat and fear. For many, confinement was punishment, a place where misdeeds met their consequence. For John, it was a new landscape, a canvas of patterns and movements he could read with precision. From the moment he was placed inside the cell, John began his silent observations. Every guard's gait, every shift in posture, every habitual glance was recorded in his mind. He noted the hinges on the doors, the weak points in the locks, the creaks of the floorboards that betrayed the steps of those who passed. Time, for him, moved not linearly but as a sequence of probabilities, each moment branching into countless possibilities, all visible to him if only he paid attention. He sat quietly on the wooden bench, hands folded, eyes tracing the pattern of sunlight through the small window. It struck him that the guards were not cruel, merely cautious, their fear amplified by the townspeople's whispers about his abilities. They did not know him, did not understand that a boy could possess awareness that surpassed their own. And none could perceive the quiet strategies forming in his mind, the deliberate patience that guided each decision. Outside his cell, conversations unfolded with careless candor. Guards discussed shifts, merchants debated the extent of his powers, and the sheriff consulted with influential townsmen. John overheard every word, committing each to memory, parsing meaning from tone, gesture, and inflection. He understood alliances before they were consciously formed, recognized hesitation before it could be concealed, and discerned intentions hidden beneath polite phrasing. One afternoon, Sheriff Whitcomb entered the cell. "John," he said, voice neutral but carrying weight, "you have been observed. People are uncertain. Some are curious, some fear you. Do you understand the position in which you find yourself?" "I do," John replied calmly. "I act as necessary. I have not harmed anyone." Whitcomb studied him for a long moment, the shadows of the barred window stretching across his face. "Your abilities, they unsettle many. Some say you influence events without moving a finger. Is this true?" John's gaze remained steady. "I observe. I respond. That is all." The sheriff shook his head slightly. "We must find a way to coexist with what we cannot understand. The city fears what it cannot name." John said nothing further, yet in silence he was already mapping future interactions, predicting the timing of conversations, the movement of keys, the shift of shadows. Each detail mattered, each moment contained potential. As days passed, the jail became a theater of observation. John noted the subtle hierarchy among the guards, the unspoken tensions between the magistrates, and the patterns of foot traffic along the corridors. He began to anticipate the moments when prisoners were fed, when visitors arrived, and when the key would turn in the lock. Every detail was stored in his mind, a catalogue of cause and effect. One evening, as Mercy visited briefly, she sensed the change in him. "Child," she whispered, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder, "do you understand what this place is doing to them? They fear you and yet they watch. You must be careful. One misstep and—" "I understand, grandmother," John replied softly. "I will move with caution. But I cannot ignore what I see." What Mercy did not know and what few would ever realize, was that John's awareness extended beyond mere prediction. He could subtly influence events through small gestures, calculated movements, and the timing of his responses. A guard's hesitation might allow a prisoner to escape notice. A misdirected glance could prevent a scuffle. Though the city believed him confined, his presence resonated beyond the walls, rippling through the courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the streets beyond. It was during this period of observation that John first encountered true malice. One guard, Thomas Rollins, resented the boy's quiet authority. Rollins had seen how townspeople whispered about John, and he feared being overshadowed by a child whose insight surpassed his own. "Boy," Rollins muttered one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe, "do you think yourself clever? This place will teach you humility." John looked at him calmly. "Humility is not earned through force. It is observed in action." Rollins scowled, unsure whether to strike, scold, or leave. What he did not realize was that his movements, his tone, and even his expression had already been anticipated. John knew the exact moment when Rollins would hesitate, when another guard would intervene, and how the man's pride would dictate his next move. By the end of the week, the guards themselves had begun to act differently around him, consciously or unconsciously, guided by the subtle influence of his presence. They spoke in measured tones, avoided direct confrontation, and often deferred to his quiet assessment. None could articulate why, yet each felt a growing unease. Meanwhile, outside the jail, the city's elite debated their next step. Merchants, clergy, and officials convened, arguing whether John's abilities were a blessing, a threat, or both. Some advocated for study, others for containment, and a few for exile. None could predict what the boy might do next. None had yet realized that his confinement had done little to limit his influence. John's awareness grew with each passing day, his understanding of cause and effect sharpening. He noted subtle patterns in conversations, the weight of hesitation, and the timing of opportunity. By observing silently, he began to manipulate circumstances with the gentlest of nudges, ensuring safety, averting disasters, and preparing for events that would soon challenge Charleston's power structure in ways none could foresee. The boy who was confined physically was free in perception. And while Charleston slept uneasy under the weight of fear and speculation, John was already several moves ahead, orchestrating outcomes invisibly, demonstrating that even in chains, his gift could not be contained. By early May, whispers of John's extraordinary abilities had begun to spread beyond the immediate streets of Charleston. Though the city's authorities debated his fate, a small network of those who recognized the potential and the danger of his gift quietly coalesced. These were people who had observed his calm precision, his uncanny foresight, and his quiet influence. Some were merchants, some artisans, and some women whose intuition recognized the boy's extraordinary nature. None could fully explain it, yet each understood its significance. Among them was Eleanor Brandt, a midwife who had long served the enslaved community and the poor white families along the city's edge. She had witnessed John save a child from a runaway horse, the mother's screams still echoing in her ears. She had noticed how he seemed to anticipate disaster before it arrived, moving with such assurance that it unsettled even the most seasoned adults. "There is a gift in that child," she whispered to her sister one evening, fingers trembling as she held a cup of tea. "And gifts like that, they are dangerous to those who cannot understand them." Eleanor was not alone. Samuel Devine, a scholar who had been dismissed from the college for controversial ideas, had taken a peculiar interest. He had seen John intervene during a minor altercation at the marketplace, redirecting a quarrel without violence, the tension evaporating almost before it fully formed. Samuel had always believed that insight, foresight, and understanding could manipulate the outcomes of human behavior. Now he saw it realized in a 12-year-old boy. That evening, Eleanor and Samuel met quietly in her candlelit parlor. "He is extraordinary," Samuel said, voice low, careful. "But extraordinary children are often destroyed by those who fear them. We must proceed with caution." Eleanor nodded. "I know. But we cannot simply stand by while they seek to contain him. The city fears what it cannot control, and John is already too aware, too perceptive, to be treated as ordinary." Word of their concerns spread quietly among trusted allies. A clandestine understanding formed. John could be protected, observed, and guided, but only by those who could anticipate the motives of Charleston's authorities, the merchant elite, and the more superstitious clergy. Each member of this small network brought skills or knowledge that complemented John's abilities, forming a secret infrastructure that operated in plain sight, hidden beneath ordinary lives. John himself sensed these subtle alignments without any introduction. He noted the people who lingered in doorways, the merchants who extended aid under the pretense of curiosity, and the women who spoke in careful tones when near his cell. Each action, subtle as it might be, carried intention. And John, always observing, catalogued them, deciding who could be trusted and who posed a latent threat. One afternoon, a letter was smuggled into his cell, delivered by a guard who had grown sympathetic after witnessing John prevent a collapse in the neighboring hall. The letter, small and neatly folded, read, "John, your gift is known. Some fear it, some seek to contain it, and some wish to protect it. Trust the hand that writes this. Observe carefully, act deliberately, and you will not falter. E.B. Eleanor Brandt." John held the letter with quiet reverence, noting the small but deliberate curl of the ink, the careful folds, the faint scent of lavender. It was both reassurance and a warning, a signal that he was no longer entirely isolated. And yet, even this act was not without risk. The letter's existence, if discovered, could endanger the woman who delivered it, the sympathetic guard, and John himself. He folded it carefully, memorizing every detail, knowing the importance of subtlety. In the following days, the first small conspiracies began to take shape. John observed patterns in the jail, guards' habits, magistrates' movements, and visitors' routines. He instructed Eleanor, through discreet messages, about optimal timing for visits, routes to avoid, and methods to relay information safely. Samuel provided insight into social hierarchies and the subtle cues that revealed intentions among Charleston's elite. Each act, though hidden, built a framework that allowed John to extend influence beyond the stone walls that confined him. It was during one such orchestrated interaction that John first tested his nascent influence deliberately. A dispute arose between two guards over a miscounted ledger. John, watching from his bench, calculated the exact moment to intervene through subtle gestures. A tilt of the head, a hand placed on the rail, a measured word whispered under the door. By the time either man realized the conflict had resolved, the cause was invisible. Yet the result was undeniable. Tension diffused, authority maintained, and John's network strengthened without exposing himself. These early conspiracies were small, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet they demonstrated John's growing mastery. The city believed him confined, controlled, and powerless. In truth, he had begun to orchestrate events from within the jail, setting the stage for confrontations and outcomes that would soon escalate far beyond the abilities of any ordinary child, or adult, to comprehend. By the end of May, John had established subtle communication with multiple allies, each connected yet unaware of the full network. Through observation, inference, and precise timing, he influenced outcomes without ever revealing the extent of his powers. Charleston's elite could not yet fathom that a boy, confined and ostensibly powerless, was quietly preparing the city, and its inhabitants, for events that would defy reason and provoke fear. What they did not know, and would not understand until much later, was that John's influence was only beginning. Every move, every observation, every whispered instruction laid the groundwork for a chain of events that would soon challenge the authority of Charleston's most powerful men, unsettle the social order, and place a 12-year-old boy squarely at the center of a conspiracy that no one could predict. By mid-June, Charleston had become a city of whispered anxieties. Rumors of John's abilities had grown, and the authorities, though uncertain of the boy's true power, acted with increasing vigilance. Yet the boy himself remained quietly observant within the stone confines of the jail, cataloging patterns, memorizing routines, and now, with the aid of his network, beginning to influence events in subtler, more deliberate ways. Hidden messages, carefully crafted and discreetly delivered, became the arteries through which John's influence spread. Eleanor Brandt, ever cautious, had devised a system using the laundry lines of her small home. A folded cloth in a specific knot indicated the timing of a visit. A differently colored ribbon signaled a warning. Each sign was deliberate, coded, and invisible to all who were not trained to read it. One morning, as the jail's routine unfolded, a soft knock came at the barred window of John's cell. A small parcel wrapped in oilcloth was pushed through the bars. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a bundle of notes written in minute-precise script. Each contained instructions, observations, and subtle guidance. Which merchants could be trusted, which guards were lax, and when the city's elite would convene to discuss his fate. He read each note, memorized the patterns, and returned the parcels to their original folds. Every detail mattered. A slight misstep could unravel the delicate balance that allowed him to operate from confinement. And yet, the thrill of control, even subtle, was not lost on him. He understood that power was measured not in force but in foresight, in knowing the exact moment to act, the precise phrase to utter, the single gesture that could redirect outcomes. That evening, Eleanor arrived for her discreet visit. Candlelight flickered across her face, revealing the anxiety etched into her features. "John," she whispered, "they are becoming impatient. The merchants, the magistrates, they speak openly now of removing you from the city or worse." John nodded slowly. "I understand. And yet, the sequences are shifting in our favor. Every action they take moves them closer to what we anticipate." Eleanor shivered. "It is one thing to foresee, child. Another to manipulate without being seen. Are you certain?" "I am certain," John interrupted softly. "I will not act recklessly. But we must prepare. The city believes they hold the advantage. They do not." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the key turning in the cell door. A guard entered, clipboard in hand. "You have visitors," he announced, clearly uncomfortable. John's eyes flicked toward the door, noting the guard's slight hesitation, the shift of weight that betrayed uncertainty. He had already predicted the sequence of events in the guard's mind, which questions would be asked, which phrases would be repeated, which actions might betray intent. He moved through the interaction with the calm of one who knows not only the steps but the outcome of every movement. Outside, the network of allies had begun to coalesce into a rudimentary strategy. Samuel Devine met with Eleanor in secret, exchanging intelligence about the city's reactions, noting who was loyal, who was fearful, and who could be manipulated. Together, they devised a plan to create controlled distractions, to feed misinformation to the city's elite, and to subtly shape events so that John's confinement would not limit his reach. One morning, John noticed a new pattern emerging among the guards. One, in particular, had begun to linger near the courtyard when no other prisoner was present. The boy observed quietly, noting every breath, every step, every glance. By noon, he had deduced the man's intentions, a petty desire to assert dominance, to test whether John's influence could be challenged. Yet when the moment arrived, the guard's plan unraveled with perfect precision. John's prior calculations had anticipated the steps, and a subtle gesture, a shift of a foot, a tilt of the head, redirected the man's actions, preserving both discretion and safety. By July, the city itself became a chessboard. Letters moved clandestinely through sympathetic hands, signals were exchanged under the cover of ordinary business, and John, from his cell, orchestrated interactions with the precision of a seasoned tactician. What Charleston did not yet understand was that the boy's influence had begun to extend into the very decisions of its leaders. Every argument, every choice, every hesitation was being gently guided by his foresight, invisible yet undeniable in its effects. "John," Eleanor whispered one night as she folded a small cloth and passed it through the bars, "we are ready to act. The city will be vulnerable in 3 days during the council meeting. All of your allies are prepared. Are you ready?" John's dark eyes reflected candlelight as he considered the moment. "We are ready," he said quietly. "And yet we must move carefully. One misstep could undo all." Eleanor nodded. "Then we act with patience. Discretion will protect us until the time comes." What they did not know, and what would become clear only in the coming days, was that John's subtle orchestration had already begun to shape events beyond the immediate knowledge of his allies. Decisions made by Charleston's leaders, movements of merchants, and even the flow of information through the city were already aligning with the sequences John had calculated. From within his cell, he held sway over outcomes, invisible yet absolute, preparing the city itself for the confrontation that would soon erupt and reveal his abilities in ways that would terrify and awe all who witnessed them. The boy who had been confined, underestimated, and whispered about in fear had now become the quiet architect of events. And in that hidden orchestration, Charleston remained blissfully unaware that the very city streets, the courtyards, and the halls of power were subtly under his guidance. By late July, Charleston had become a city teetering between curiosity and panic. Rumors of John's extraordinary abilities no longer confined themselves to whispers in taverns and parlors. They roamed the streets openly, carried by merchants, children, and servants alike. The boy who had once been merely confined to a jail cell had transformed in the public imagination into a figure of dread and fascination. Every corner of the city seemed alive with speculation. Market stalls buzzed with debates. Some spoke of miracles, others of unnatural manipulation, and a few whispered of curses. Mothers clutched their children tighter as they passed the jail, fearing the boy's unseen influence. Merchants fretted over missed deliveries and minor accidents, attributing them to John's growing sway. And clergy, faces drawn with concern, debated whether prayer, fasting, or exorcism might counteract what no human could explain. Within the sheriff's office, anxiety festered. Sheriff Whitcomb pored over reports from his deputies, each detailing incidents that seemed trivial in isolation but, when combined, formed patterns that defied logic. "Hawkins," he said, voice tight, "the boy is influencing events beyond this building. Minor accidents, miscommunications, delays, they all seem coordinated as if guided by intention." Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it is just a boy. How can he—" "Do not interrupt me," Whitcomb snapped. "We have a situation that cannot be ignored. Every action, every observation, every report points to the same conclusion. He is far from powerless. And the city senses it. The merchants, the magistrates, even the guards are uneasy." Meanwhile, John continued his silent orchestration within the jail. The boy had already anticipated the rising tension, mapping it like constellations in the night sky, connecting points invisible to those around him. Each shift in the city's mood, every nervous glance from a merchant, every whispered warning in the streets, all were catalogued and absorbed. He understood that fear was a force as potent as any physical weapon, and he wielded it with care, subtly influencing outcomes without overt action. Even the guards, who had grown accustomed to his calm presence, began to falter under the weight of uncertainty. Thomas Rollins, still resentful from previous encounters, now found himself second-guessing every step. He lingered in doorways, hesitated on orders, and avoided eye contact, all without realizing that the boy had already anticipated his behavior. Every movement, every hesitation, every shift in tone played into John's careful orchestration. Outside the jail, Eleanor Brandt and Samuel Devine worked tirelessly to support him. They navigated Charleston's social hierarchy with precision, spreading subtle hints, creating controlled distractions, and feeding information to carefully selected individuals. Each act was calculated to ensure that the city remained off balance, unable to pinpoint the origin of the disturbances, while simultaneously reinforcing John's growing influence. One afternoon, Samuel leaned close to Eleanor in the dim light of her parlor. "The council meets tomorrow," he said, voice low. "Every member is nervous. They have heard the rumors. They fear the boy. We must ensure that nothing goes awry." Eleanor nodded. "He is ready. We have observed every shift, every hesitation. By tomorrow they will be guided, whether they know it or not." John, in his cell, prepared for the culmination of weeks of observation and subtle intervention. He had mapped the schedules, memorized the patterns, and identified the weaknesses in Charleston's social and administrative systems. Every conversation, every dispute, every minor incident had been cataloged and folded into his plans. What the city could not see, and what none could predict, was that his influence extended far beyond the stone walls, orchestrating outcomes that would soon challenge the very authority of Charleston's elite. Even those who feared him most were unaware of the boy's full capabilities. Clergy debated whether he was a force of divine providence or an agent of mischief. Merchants feared lost profits but were powerless to act decisively. Magistrates attempted to consolidate control, but every order seemed to backfire, every plan undone by invisible forces. John's silent manipulation had begun to shape the city itself, bending events to a sequence he alone fully understood. As night fell, Charleston braced itself for the council meeting the next day. Lanterns flickered in windows, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets. Guards patrolled more vigilantly, merchants closed shops early, and whispers traveled through alleys with urgency. None could predict what was about to unfold. None could see that the boy they had confined, underestimated, and whispered about in fear was already several steps ahead, guiding the city's actions with subtle precision. In his cell, John sat quietly, listening to the city breathe around him. Every sound, the clatter of hooves, the rustle of garments, the faint laughter of children, was a thread in the tapestry he was weaving. He understood the stakes, the risks, and the power of his foresight. And he knew that, by the following day, Charleston would bear witness to events that no one could have imagined, a confrontation that would reveal the depth of his abilities and the consequences of underestimating a child whose gift defied reason. The night passed slowly, tension thick in the air. And as dawn approached, the city held its collective breath, unaware that a sequence of events, carefully orchestrated by a boy no more than 12, was about to unfold. A sequence that would challenge their authority, unsettle their assumptions, and leave an indelible mark on Charleston's history. The morning of the council meeting arrived under a sky streaked with clouds, a gray pall that seemed to press down on Charleston's streets. Lanterns flickered in the early light, shadows stretching across the cobblestones, and the air carried the sharp tang of salt from the nearby harbor. Merchants, magistrates, and townsfolk gathered in uneasy anticipation, each step measured, each glance wary. The city seemed to hold its breath, sensing that the sequence of events orchestrated by John Whitmore was about to come to fruition. Inside the council chamber, whispers reverberated off the high ceilings. Sheriff Whitcomb, flanked by a few deputies, consulted with magistrates, his expression tense. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low but firm, "this boy, John Whitmore, is no ordinary child. Every precaution we take seems anticipated. Every measure is countered before we can act. We must proceed with caution." A merchant, heavy-set and sweating despite the cool morning air, spoke up. "Sheriff, we cannot simply contain him any longer. He disrupts trade, incites fear, and influences outcomes we cannot explain. If we do not act decisively, the city itself will suffer." "Calm yourself," Whitcomb replied, though his own unease was visible. "Decisive action must be measured. Panic will only worsen matters." Meanwhile, within the jail, John sat quietly on the bench, observing the routine shifts of the guards, listening to their cautious voices. Every step, every tone, every small gesture had been calculated. He knew the patterns that would unfold in the council chamber, the decisions that would be debated, and the minor disruptions that would tilt the balance in his favor. What the authorities did not yet comprehend was that the boy they had confined was several moves ahead, orchestrating outcomes with the subtlety of a master tactician. A knock at the door signaled Eleanor's arrival. She pushed a folded cloth through the bars, a signal of readiness. John read the pattern immediately. The council would convene, tensions would rise, and the city's elite would make critical missteps without realizing it. Every element had been prepared, every ally strategically placed, every outcome anticipated. "John," Eleanor whispered, voice low, "everything is set. They are vulnerable and we have influence in every room that matters. Are you ready?" John's dark eyes reflected the faint light filtering through the window. "We are ready," he said softly. "But we act with precision. One error, one misstep, and the sequence collapses." By mid-morning, the council convened. Tension hung heavy in the chamber, palpable and almost suffocating. Each participant was acutely aware of the rumors swirling around the boy in the jail. The slightest incident seemed amplified in significance. Every word, every hesitation, every glance carried weight. Suddenly, a minor accident occurred. A candle flickered dangerously near a stack of papers, threatening to ignite the chamber. Chaos flickered in the eyes of those present. Yet before anyone could react, a guard's quick step redirected the candle, a subtle maneuver orchestrated by John's prior influence and observation. No one noticed the intervention as intentional. They only felt a fleeting sense of relief and bewilderment. Samuel Devine and Eleanor, discreetly stationed nearby, exchanged silent acknowledgments. The sequence had begun as intended. The city's elite, unprepared for the boy's invisible orchestration, were now caught in the web of outcomes John had prepared. In the jail, John continued to observe, calculating the unfolding events. A magistrate's raised voice, a merchant's nervous cough, the subtle hesitation of a guard, all were recorded and processed in his mind. He anticipated each next move, predicting outcomes with uncanny accuracy. Every micro-movement, every conversation, every sigh of relief or gasp of surprise fed into the larger pattern he had established. Then came the first real test. A prominent councilman, emboldened by fear and hubris, attempted to confront the situation directly, questioning the sheriff about John's influence. "Sheriff," he demanded, "how long will we allow this child to manipulate outcomes without consequence? We must act." Whitcomb, wary and uneasy, replied, "We act with caution. The boy's abilities are not fully understood. Rash action will only provoke unforeseen results." The councilman sneered, insisting on immediate action. Yet, just as he rose, a minor disturbance occurred outside the chamber. A spill of oil in the hallway, a tripping messenger, the accidental displacement of a ledger. Chaos flickered, subtle but undeniable. The councilman's anger faltered, his words caught in his throat. What he did not know, and what none in the chamber realized, was that John had anticipated this disruption, nudging events with the smallest, most invisible gestures through his network and careful observation. By noon, tension had reached its apex. Every member of the council felt unease they could not name. Decisions wavered, plans faltered, and the city's elite found themselves caught in a web of outcomes they could not control. The boy they had underestimated, confined, and whispered about in fear was now orchestrating consequences beyond their comprehension, demonstrating that power need not be physical to be absolute. Outside the chamber, Eleanor and Samuel quietly guided events, reinforcing John's influence. Couriers delivered messages at precise intervals, signals were exchanged through subtle gestures, and minor disturbances were timed to perfection. By the time the council reconvened, every participant had been subtly manipulated into positions that aligned with John's predictions. The boy's gift, his foresight, and his patience culminated in a sequence of events that left Charleston's elite both confounded and, unbeknownst to them, entirely under the guidance of a 12-year-old boy in a jail cell. And in that quiet, unseen orchestration, John Whitmore proved that confinement could not limit foresight, that fear could be wielded as power, and that the most unlikely of figures could become the invisible architect of a city's fate. By mid-afternoon, the calm facade of Charleston had completely fractured. The subtle manipulations, careful orchestration, and whispered warnings had built to a crescendo. Merchants hurried through streets, voices trembling with fear and speculation. Townspeople crowded windows and doorways, eager to witness events that none could fully explain. Rumors had grown into hysteria. A boy in confinement, 12 years old, capable of bending outcomes and influencing men of authority. Inside the council chamber, the tension was nearly unbearable. Sheriff Whitcomb's face, drawn and pale, reflected the strain of months of observation and uncertainty. "Gentlemen," he said, voice tight, "we are no longer dealing with conjecture. The boy's influence is demonstrable. Every minor disruption, every hesitation, every failed decision, calculated, orchestrated, and directed. We are now part of the experiment." A councilman, red-faced with indignation, slammed his hand on the table. "This is preposterous. A child, confined in a cell, could not possibly, it is impossible." "Impossible," Whitcomb echoed, though his voice lacked conviction. "And yet it is occurring." Outside, John Whitmore's influence manifested with precision. Through his network, Eleanor and Samuel coordinated small events. An overturned cart at the marketplace, a misdelivered letter, a lantern knocked into the street, each minor disruption feeding the perception of chaos. Merchants collided in narrow alleys, children screamed as horses bolted in startled panic, and rumors spread like wildfire. The city itself seemed to react, pliant in ways orchestrated entirely by the boy's foresight. Within the jail, John observed every development with quiet calculation. The boy had predicted the reactions of councilmen, merchants, guards, and townspeople. Each hesitation, each tremor of fear, each misstep unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. And yet, he remained patient, knowing that the true revelation had not yet arrived. Then came the moment. A messenger, unaware of the intricate network of influence, delivered a letter to the council chamber. The contents, though innocuous in appearance, contained subtle cues, timing, phrasing, and emphasis that John had anticipated weeks prior. As the councilman read, confusion rippled through the chamber. Arguments collapsed, plans faltered, and the room fell into a tense silence. None could comprehend how such disruption could emanate from a boy confined within a stone cell. A murmur spread through the crowd outside. "It is true," one woman whispered. "He can see everything. He knows everything." A man scoffed nervously. "You speak nonsense. He is a child. How can he orchestrate what we see?" Yet the chaos unfolded with relentless precision. Horses bolted down streets at unexpected moments, merchants argued over errors that seemed to appear spontaneously, and guards found themselves hesitating, unsure how to act without making matters worse. The city's elite were caught in a web they could not escape, their every move anticipated, guided, and undermined by the boy they had dismissed. Inside the jail, John's dark eyes reflected the flickering shadows of the bars. He calculated the final sequence, anticipating the precise moment when the council would attempt to act decisively. Every ally, every subtle intervention, every minor disruption had prepared the stage for the revelation that would shock Charleston to its core. Eleanor Brandt, stationed nearby, whispered into the ear of a sympathetic guard, guiding him to act at the exact moment. Samuel Devine observed from a discreet vantage point, signaling through subtle gestures the completion of each planned disruption. Every detail had been accounted for, every possible deviation anticipated. The stage was set, and then it occurred. A lantern, deliberately nudged by a courier under John's guidance, fell and cracked, spilling oil across the polished floor of the council chamber. Panic erupted instantly. Merchants and councilmen scrambled to avoid disaster, guards shouted orders, and the room descended into chaos. In that precise instant, John's orchestration became undeniable. Every move, every hesitation, every misstep had been predicted, and the city itself seemed to react in accordance with his unseen hand. Voices rose in fear and awe. "He is here," one man cried. "He controls all." "Impossible," another shouted, but his protest was drowned by the cacophony of confusion and fear. Sheriff Whitcomb, realizing the full extent of the situation, attempted to restore order. "Enough," he commanded, voice strained. "This child, he is extraordinary, yes, but we must remain rational." Rationality, however, had been rendered irrelevant. The city's fabric had been shifted, perceptions manipulated, and every authority undermined by a 12-year-old boy who had observed, calculated, and guided events from his cell with invisible precision. John Whitmore, silent and unassuming, watched from behind the bars. The culmination of weeks of subtle influence, covert communication, and precise observation had reached its apex. Charleston's elite were confronted with an undeniable truth. The boy they had underestimated and confined possessed a power that defied explanation, a power that rendered their authority fragile and their assumptions dangerously flawed. And in that moment, the city itself seemed to acknowledge the invisible hand that had guided it, the unseen architect who had orchestrated chaos with nothing more than foresight, patience, and the careful manipulation of cause and effect. The sun set over Charleston that evening, casting long, distorted shadows across cobblestone streets, as if the city itself were stretched thin by the day's events. What had begun as subtle manipulation and quiet orchestration had erupted into a confrontation that left merchants, magistrates, and guards shaken to their core. Panic had given way to astonishment, fear had transformed into grudging respect, and the once unassailable authority of the city's elite now appeared fragile, vulnerable, and in many ways irrelevant. Within the jail, John Whitmore remained calm, the faint flicker of candlelight reflecting in his dark eyes. He had observed the city for months, anticipating every hesitation, every misstep, and every panic-stricken reaction. Now, as the chaos subsided and whispers of his abilities traveled through Charleston like wildfire, he allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He had not acted recklessly. He had not sought glory. Every action, every subtle influence had been guided by calculation, foresight, and necessity. Eleanor Brandt and Samuel Devine moved through the streets that evening, checking on allies, ensuring no one faced reprisal, and witnessing the reverberations of the day. "It is done," Eleanor said softly, her voice almost drowned by the distant clatter of carts and the murmurs of astonished townspeople. Samuel nodded. "Yes. But what remains is not the chaos itself, but the memory of it. They will speak of John Whitmore for years to come, though whether in fear, awe, or disbelief none can yet say." News of the confrontation spread quickly. Merchants whispered in taverns. Magistrates convened emergency councils to discuss their failures. Clergy debated sermons, seeking explanation for what no one could rationalize. John's abilities became legend almost overnight. Some attributed them to divine providence, others to witchcraft, and a few, quieter voices, understood them as nothing less than extraordinary foresight, a rare and inexplicable talent that had altered the course of events without the use of violence or force. Sheriff Whitcomb, now exhausted beyond measure, recorded what had occurred in his private ledger. "Never in my tenure," he wrote, "have I witnessed a child manipulate outcomes with such precision. He is not merely observant. He is orchestrator. And though we confined him, we were powerless against his influence. The boy's mind is a force that defies reason, and the city itself bends to it." In the following weeks, Charleston settled into a tense, uneasy equilibrium. Life continued in its ordinary rhythms, yet the memory of John Whitmore's orchestration lingered like a shadow. Merchants recalculated risks with extreme caution. Magistrates reviewed every decision twice, thrice, considering possibilities they had previously ignored. Guards patrolled with heightened awareness, observing patterns and behaviors as if anticipating subtle manipulations. Even children in the streets spoke in hushed tones of a boy whose eyes saw further than any adult, whose mind anticipated more than any scholar. John himself remained within the jail, his confinement unchanged, yet his influence had transcended walls. What they did not know, what they could not comprehend, was that his power did not lie in physical freedom but in calculation, observation, and the subtle nudging of events. Even from behind iron bars, he had reshaped Charleston, guiding outcomes with a quiet, invisible hand. Years later, historians would debate the events of that summer in Charleston. Some accounts described the city's panic, the inexplicable accidents, the failed decisions of its leaders. Others focused on the boy, emphasizing the uncanny precision with which events unfolded. Whether John Whitmore's actions were guided by innate genius, divine inspiration, or some other force, none could deny the impact he had on the city and its people. And the story, carefully buried in official records and oral accounts, persisted as a legend whispered across generations. Eleanor and Samuel, now older and wiser, reflected on the lessons of that time. Power is not always physical, Eleanor said, gazing at the horizon where the last light of day met the harbor waters. Influence, foresight, and patience can shape outcomes more profoundly than any sword or decree. Samuel nodded. And yet, he replied, the true lesson is humility. Even the most powerful, the most confident, can be undone by what they cannot perceive, by what they fail to anticipate. John Whitmore reminded us all of that, in ways we could scarcely imagine at the time. And so, Charleston carried forward, changed but resilient, a city forever aware that even the smallest figure, a 12-year-old boy confined behind stone walls, could orchestrate events beyond the comprehension of its leaders. The boy's name, whispered in fear and awe, became a symbol of unseen influence, subtle power, and the enduring mystery of human potential. Before we uncover more stories like John Whitmore's, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment your state below. What do you think? Was John merely gifted, or was there something else guiding him? Share your thoughts. And if you want more dark historical mysteries that blur the line between history and the inexplicable, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves tales of fear, power, and unseen influence. These voices need to be remembered.